Thank you. Thank you. Well, everybody is very, very welcome. Many of you were part of our Dante reading from the very beginning, from last September, and right through until Thursday of last week when we did the end of Paradiso. And those of you who were with me all along the journey and with John, you will have had week by week a picture of every single canto. And this is the book that we've had on the table all the time for the 100 cantos of Dante, illustrated by Liam Ó Broin in a very, very wonderful way. I don't quite like to use the word illustrated, rather interpreted, because Liam picks details in each canto and by and large links those details to our own experience of life, showing us how Dante is still very, very relevant nowadays. And as we went through these, the idea came up a few weeks ago, middle of our reading. I suddenly said, well, would you like to meet him, seeing that we're using this book all the time? And the general consensus was yes. And I was delighted that James and Ethna immediately collaborated and said, yes, it would be lovely to have Liam tell us about his own interpretation of Dante. Liam has done a lot more than Dante, a lot more and in different art forms, and was associated with the National College for Art and Design all his life. And I want to show you, and I will pass it around, a sculpture of Francis Ledwidge, which I particularly love of his work, because we've concentrated entirely on Dante, but there is much more there. And this Francis Ledwidge was inaugurated the sculpture in Slane 100 years exactly to commemorate the death of Ledwidge, the poet, in 2017. And so I thought it would be something I'd like to pass around to give you a sense of how eclectic the work of Liam is. And he himself will tell you from Inferno 3 how the gates of hell have inspired a major piece of sculpture in bronze that is a very anguishing piece on the inhumanity of man to man. So I will not take up more time talking myself. The relevant point is that we have Liam amongst us, and he will tell us about his engagement with Dante and how he has interpreted over the years. It's a very long, well, a 12-year project. And I still remember at the very first exhibition, when it wasn't not all 100 were ready, that I walked into the Italian Cultural Institute, into the pavilion room, and those gates of hell really were striking, absolutely. And from there, it's been a great privilege on my part to keep in touch with Liam over the years and collaborate and eventually have this lovely book. And the exhibition in Dublin Castle for about 4 months, opened by President Higgins, and a wonderful tribute both to Dante and to how he's still inspiring artists nowadays. So an applause for Liam.
Thank you. Right, so after all of that, and thank you very much, Tina, for the introduction. I'm on the mat now, so I have to, as it were, explain myself. I think I'll go straight in and say that one of the things that struck me in particular about the Inferno reminded me of a poem by Seamus Heaney called Digging. And the title of the poem stuck with me for quite some time. And it kept sort of almost etching itself into my brain. And I felt, you know, that it had a great resonance with Dante's Commedia, because the whole idea, the whole notion of Heaney's work, particularly in relation to his collection of poems, Death of a Naturalist, was that the ground, the earth, was it seemed to be almost his place. And so I think that Heaney's choice of words are very significant because of that fascination with the ground, with land. And I think that also, we really do have to, as observers and readers of Dante, we have to do a fair amount of digging. Now, I can't speak for you, but I certainly know that from my perspective, that was the case. I really did have to dig and dig and dig. And I liked that idea. I liked the challenge of it. Now, what I propose to do as I'm running through these slides, which I believe most of which you've already seen, so I don't want to bore you to death. So what I'm proposing to do is that I'll run through the slides, if, as it were, as a kind of preamble. And then at the end, I've selected a number of slides in anticipation that there won't be any questions. But on the other hand, if there are, please feel free to answer or to ask any questions that you might like, and I'll do my best to answer them. So in many ways, sometimes one doesn't actually have to say very much about these images, I hope, because I think probably they do rather speak for themselves. And this particular one, Canto 4, is one that's always been very close to my heart because of it. For me, it has resonance with the famine, but more than that, and I mean by that the Irish famine, but more than that, I think it has resonance with the now, the here, that Dante's talking about limbo, but you know, the reality is that whether you believe in limbo or not in the religious context, there's no doubt in my mind that limbo actually exists. There are so many people trapped in situations they just can't get out of. And usually when it comes to civil strife and war, the end result is that it's women and children who suffer most. I also very much like the whole notion of Paolo and Francesca. It's a wonderful story, and it's one that appeals probably to quite a lot of the younger generation as well as the older generation. And it's maybe one of the examples in the Inferno where, in the whole Commedia, in fact, where Dante does have a very perceptible humanistic approach to what, after all, is a situation where two people have been condemned for lust. I don't think he quite sees it like that. We have Cerberus, the three-headed dog, guarding the place of the gluttonous. And then I really would like to say that despite, you know, the constraints of what was known and understood in Dante's world, the human imagination was always broad-reaching. And I think it would be true to say that without imagination, we really would be still in the Stone Age. I mean, all that we've achieved in medicine and science, everything had to, in the first instance, spring from the human urge of curiosity. What if? And as I've said here, Jonathan Swift said it much more succinctly. We're limited not by our abilities, but by our vision. And there is an element in Dante which I've begun to explore lately, and that's to do with the whole notion of the cosmos and the other galaxies out there, up there. And already, you know, in that context, there are scientists who wouldn't just colonize Mars or any planet, but now are actually working on the idea that they might be able to change the atmospheres of those planets for human settlement. And if that seems a fantasy, isn't it true to say we've already changed the atmosphere here on Earth? And not, as I said here, to our great credit. And yet it appears that instead of focusing all our efforts on repairing the damage that's been done, that we've done, the focus is on moving on instead. And so this, you know, Inferno goes on and unfolds bit by bit. And to put it all into the context, we really do, as I've touched on, have to consider, I hope, that Dante managed to, and by virtue of his imagination, he left the earth and he went into space and he set foot on the moon, which was then a little understood. In fact, to the belief at the time that it was actually transparent, and we know all that. But there's a common denominator in mankind across millennia, and that by virtue of the wonder of the existence of anything, there may be something infinitely bigger than all of us put together. And if there is something, someone out there who's responsible for entity itself, trying to make sense of that has taken on many, many different forms throughout the ages, from sun worship to a multiplicity of gods to a one omnipotent God. But here's the rub. Finding an answer to that is one problem, but the problem has been confounded in how we as humans have chosen in the past and in the present the ways of affirming those beliefs. And so our human condition has, to my way of thinking, a fundamental thread throughout history, the umbilical cord of vision. And in the Commedia, Dante fuses the ancient classical world, the medieval world, the cosmos, and time itself. The past actually merges into the present. Time is almost eliminated. And if I needed an example, I think, I would point to Paradiso 1, where Dante is wondering. He's in wonder about the heavens. And Beatrice gives him to what, to my mind, is an absolutely stunning, stunning answer. And she says, "You're not on this earth as you believe, but lightning fleeing from its proper place never sped as fast as you going back to yours." That actually makes the hairs stand on the back of my head, because it brings us right up into the present day and the discussions that are taking place about time and the expanding universe. Is it not, etc., etc. And really, it would be true to say that these words are probably, rather than coming from Beatrice, they're more like the words that would come from someone like Professor Brian Cox, talking about the paradox of time. And instead, we're listening to the words that were written by someone 700 years ago in medieval times. And then when Dante takes himself and us into the heavens within that spectrum of a medieval imagination, and when he comes face to face with the infinite, I think it's also true to say that we're left really interestingly with the core discovery of his journey. And Dante, for me, defines it very clearly. It comes across as a code of reasoned behavior towards our fellow humans and the world in which we live. And I think this is essentially what Dante is saying, and it's really what moves Dante's sun and stars. Another interesting, on a sort of side note, an interesting element, I think, throughout the Inferno in particular, is how many classical mythical characters, like Capaneus in hell for arrogance against the gods, Cerberus, the three-headed dog, guarding the circle of the gluttonous, King Minos, who judges with the flick of his tail, the damned, and the centaurs guarding the murderous. Every single one of them has a job to play, a role to play in hell. And they're all pre-Christian, and yet they're in hell. I find that very interesting. So really this body of work, these 100 lithographs, are, from a personal perspective, are a series of images which keep within some measure of orbit to the text, sometimes very deliberately iconic, but other times I've been very deliberately pastiche. And really the motivation behind that is in order to use a visual language, a familiar visual language. So I see my interpretation as an elliptical orbit around Dante's text, sometimes close, but every so often taking a wider arc across history and right up into the present day. And that here and now is not necessarily rooted in any one particular place. It's probably best described by Milton when he says, the mind's its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And another interesting question, do heaven, hell, purgatory, or even God exist? I like to think that they can, at least at the very least, in a state of mind. And I must say here, I am not an apologist for one particular religion over another as the only way for men and women to achieve a state of spiritual contentment. Far from that, I prefer to take the view that each one of us has a desire for justice and fairness, and that's intrinsic to our nature. While on the other hand, there is also the urge of human greed and selfishness. And as humans, I'm afraid to say, but it's true, we'll always be at war with ourselves on this one. Humanity is another word that springs to mind as I worked on the Commedia. And what resonates again and again about the Commedia, its essential core, is I really do believe it's humanity. It's a poem which has really at its center a deep connection with the very ordinary, our human condition. And it's through a poem which a deeply religious and a very human poet has chosen to tell a story against the background of his time. And it's through poetry, especially, that we can see the world in which we live in a multi-dimensional way, where reality becomes tightly interwoven with the world of the imagination. And so the humanity in Dante connects with the human condition as we know it, literally from our own personal experiences, in our own lives precisely, I think, because of this. In essence, I think the Commedia is a mirror. We see ourselves in the here and the now. And then we have love. And the element of love which creates the template for the entire story begins, as we all know, with that love affair with Beatrice. And I think an aspect, perhaps, of it all is that there's certainly one thing could be said, that in the social structure of Florence or any city, anywhere, for a young man or a young woman or anybody to get a glimpse of his beloved or her beloved, aside from perhaps from a distance along a pew at Sunday Mass, was very rare. I think it would have been a major event. You could even argue that by extension, that would make it even all the more intense. So that's one of the things that I can identify with when I read what Dante has to say about Beatrice. And then, of course, we know what happened when Beatrice died at a very early age, having been married to somebody else. Karina and I were just actually having a discussion shortly before we started on the whole notion of Dante being lost. And she very accurately pointed out to me, and I learn every day, that Dante wasn't lost. But whatever it was that may have caused some kind of digress, I think Dante certainly got through it in no short measure. This particular piece is actually two cantos in one. Some I've treated as singular, some I've treated as diptychs, and others as triptychs. And that's purely a design a solution, because in some cases it struck me that a single drawing of a single canto didn't actually fit the bill. So if there's any doubt in anyone's mind as to what that actually is about, the top left-hand portion is the Simonac pumps being stuffed into the holes with the tongues of fire landing on the soles of their feet. And then these people on the bottom right are the ones that dared look into the future. And so they have to walk backwards to get forward. This one here is almost an illustration of what happens Dante and Virgil in Canto 21 when they come face to face with an infernal mob who block their way. But I think as well, for me, when I was working on it, I thought, but like that's something that could happen to any one of us in any place, in any city, if we just happened to be the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's certainly true. Another aspect of Dante, which an Italian contact of mine put to me, was that he is from Florence, and he says that in the summertime, every week or so, outside the Santa Croce church in Florence, Roberto Benigni gives his renditions of several cantos, and apparently they are so popular that you could hear a pin drop. But we know that Dante is beloved of his fellow Italians. But it just struck me in that story that man told me, and I thought when I was doing this illustration for the demons with their pitchforks arguing over the lake of black pitch, I thought, I wonder if Dante put this in. There isn't really any particular moral issue at stake here. And it struck me that there was something just slightly Shakespearean about it, in the sense that I think Dante is a fabulous storyteller. And I suspect that if not the primary reason, certainly a secondary reason for the Commedia must have been that it was meant to be read. And so I think for the entertainment of the masses, and we should bear in mind, there was no accident that he wrote the whole thing in Tuscan in the first place for that reason. I think this one might have been put in as a sort of a little bit of comedy, a bit of pantomime, just to keep the Mr. and Mrs. Smith amused. So I thought I'd put that in as well for the same reason. And so we go on and we go on. These you're all probably very familiar with. I like this metamorphosis idea of Agnello, the teeth, and his attitude. This one here is a lithograph which I actually like very much because it's the death of Ulysses from Canto 26. It's interesting when you read about the journey that they made through the pillars of Hercules and sailed into the Western Ocean for something like 3 or 4 months, and then they were shipwrecked. I often wonder, was it somewhere around the Skelligs that it happened? Interesting. But anyway, and then another thing that we've got to deal with here in the 20th century, 21st century, is this whole plethora, the bombardment that's put before us of false, fake news, spin. And this is directly related to Canto 28. Another one that I think for me, this particular one has quite a lot going in it, even though it just appears to be a slightly confusing drawing. And what I'm trying to do here is, if you like, somehow or other reflect the whole notion of the foragers, the counterfeiters, and the copiers. And I worry sometimes that with genetic engineering and all the strides that are being made and have been made in that regard, that we may just be slipping down a slippery path, which we may not be able to control. If we can control it and regulate it, then fine, but it makes me nervous. And then the disappeared. I mean, even though this particular lithograph was based on the Madre di Plaza de Mayo, I still feel that it has a resonance with much of what we should be aware of in our history. And not only just from a political point of view, but even the number of people out there who are suffering because their loved ones have disappeared without a trace. It must be something horrendous to have to wake up to every morning and to deal with when you go to bed at night. And my heart bleeds for people in that situation. And then the two, or rather the three, this triptych was really my take on the whole story of Ugolino. And of course, we know that Heaney wrote an amazing piece based on Ugolino. And some people have asked me, why did I do the triptych? And really what I just wanted to do was to give some notion of the idea that not only was Ugolino punished in a terrible way, but his sons and his grandsons also suffered the same fate. And Dante doesn't really have a lot of time for traitors in the community. But as I said earlier, he certainly does seem to have rather more empathy with the more human side of sin. Now this one is the final chapter, as it were, in Inferno, where the two, Virgil and Dante, begin to emerge from the bottom pit of hell, and they start to climb up along Lucifer. And so that's why I have them upside down, because as you'll recall, that's actually, they found themselves doing that. So I thought that might be a little bit more pertinent. And actually, funnily enough, I had made it the other way around. And it was one day when I walked into the studio, and it's an example of what I call, and what many artists call, the happy accident. I just happened to have put that lithograph down the other way on the table, and it had been bugging me for days. I knew there was something it hadn't quite hit the mark. And when I saw it on the table and it was like that, I suddenly went, my God, that's it. And, you know, it was purely and simply, and I'm the first to admit it was an accident. So now we're on to Purgatorio, and what becomes very interesting in Dante's structure throughout Purgatorio is the way in which the whole 33 cantos actually focus on self-purgation on the part of Dante's sinners. And I think the modern reader can only be struck by the notion that in Dante's scheme of things, at least, that Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso can really be seen to be created by ourselves, by us, in our own world, here and now. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, when you die. I think hell, heaven, and earth, or hell, heaven, and purgatory can be around us in many, many different ways. And this is an interesting one because, again, there's no moral issue at stake or in discussion here. It's purely and simply Dante's, not his preoccupation, but certainly Dante himself had a very, very acute awareness and an interest in the whole notion of the cosmos and in science. And the fact that he was staying in these different places as the guests of well-off lords of the manor, he must have come in contact with many intellectuals. And there was probably some very interesting discussions that took place at supper in the evening amongst them, not least of which would have been astronomy. And in this one, in Purgatorio 3, as I say, there's no actual moral issue to my reading of it at stake. And what Dante notices is that everybody else in purgatory is transparent and he's solid. And he sees it, and he sees that because of that, he just simply notices his shadow. And that's, I think that's fascinating because it gives an insight into the man himself and, if you like, the peripherals of what he was possibly concerned with. And here's another, this following canto is a very good example of his awareness of the world around him and outer space. And initially, when you look at this, you say, well, what's this about? What's going on here? But in actual fact, there's a lot going on because Dante and Virgil have stopped to rest on the terrace of purgatory as they climb up. And when they stop, they face east. You might have to grapple with this. I hope I don't do you a disservice by saying that. But they face east, and Dante notices that the sun is actually over his left shoulder. And he ponders that and then suddenly realizes, yeah, but we're in the southern hemisphere because we went into hell through the northern hemisphere. We climbed up and now we're on the far side. So the sun has switched. And I think this is, again, is a very interesting example of, if you like, someone just making an aside, but a very interesting one. And then there's some pretty hefty stuff happening in Purgatorio. And this is one very good example, I think. I mean, it goes without saying that no matter where you go in big cities, you'll always see an equestrian statue with a proud emperor in the saddle, a sign of imperialism, a sign of a ruler, a sign of power. And yet here we have Dante castigating Italy and Europe for being like a riderless horse, leaderless. And he really did feel very strongly about that. And he also castigates the European rulers at the time for the same thing, for neglecting leadership through self-interest. I wonder, I'm not a Eurosceptic by any means, but I wonder, is this familiar ground? And so we go on and on. An interesting thing about the Annunciation, to my way of thinking, is I remember visiting Florence and seeing for the first time the fresco by Fra Angelico of the Annunciation. And I have to say, I was totally spellbound. And what struck me about it was that it would not, I felt that it was almost irrelevant whether one actually believed in the concept of the Annunciation or not. Because what you were confronted with was a profound work of art. There was something incredibly, imaginatively profound happening in the imagery. And that certainly resonated with me quite a lot. This one might be of interest. I would suspect that probably quite a number of people may not actually know where this notion of the envious with their eyes stitched with wire originated from. But in fact, Dante himself as a man, as a young man, would have been very, very familiar with falconry. And it was the practice in those days that when a wild falcon was caught, in order to calm it and prevent it from damaging itself while being handled. Thin pieces of wire were used as thread to stitch the eyelids. And then progressively, as the falcon became used to the falconer's voice and handling, the wires were untwisted so that gradually the eyes could open, and eventually then he would tolerate this Homo sapien who had trapped him, and consequently would then, as a result, would come back to him when called. And it's very interesting. Here we have Dante, if you like, putting in something that from everyday life, ordinary everyday life, and using it in an instance like the envious in Purgatorio. This one was a tough one, I have to say, because when I came across the idea, or when I, if you like, dreamed up the idea that I wanted to show Cain and Abel, I thought with myself, very, very difficult what to do. And then I eventually honed it down. And I think what I did was I managed to get a drawing that somehow or other, if you like, reflected the very thin, and that's what I wanted to do, the very thin boundary between love and hate. In other words, was this an embrace? And then, you know, almost imperceptibly became an act of violence. Mm. And this one here, I have to confess that the only way I could deal with the whole notion of Dante's idea of having something to share, and that the more you shared it, the more you had, was the Christian concept of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. And where better than to look but at a high cross in County Kildare, and that's where that was taken from. Mm-hmm. And then we have the black smoke of wrath and anger. And I think that's something that Dante felt very strongly about. You know, it shouldn't be an eye for an eye, and we shouldn't kill the dove of peace. But unfortunately, that's what we're doing, or at least some of us. Mm-hmm. And here's an interesting one, I think, from, well, at least from my perspective. And it's someone who, I actually love this because it's one of my favorites. And if for no other reason that I had the opportunity to actually work with gold. I mean, that is 24 karat gold. And it was lovely to actually go order it and wait for it to arrive in the post and then put it down onto the print. I really did enjoy doing it. But I also enjoy reading about Crassus, because he was a general, a Roman general, as you probably know, but also he was a housing speculator. And apparently the story goes that he had a team of men who would go around and they would make on the spot offers when buildings were being burned down to the unfortunate tenants, and buy the plot at a knockdown price. And as a result, he amassed a massive fortune. And we're led to believe that eventually, when he was killed in battle and his enemies beheaded him, they poured molten gold down his open mouth and said, "Crassus, tell us, because you know, how does gold taste?" And I thought, that's great. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just checking our time because I'm very conscious of the fact that what time do we need to wrap up, James? You could keep going for another few minutes. Okay, yeah. So I'll speed things up.
Thank you.
I think this is important. I think that the whole notion of loss is really, again, at the core of the Commedia. And Dante, for one reason or another, is prostrate with remorse in front of Beatrice in Canto 30. And I think the episode is, as I've said here, is a has a very strong underlying, almost erotic element of an intensity. And we should remember that this scene is coming from the hand that wields the pen. And then, by extension, it's self-accusation on the part of Dante. But I think that what's poignant about this is that if you look up on the top left-hand corner, you'll see on the terrace a tiny little figure of Virgil, because it's at this stage in Canto 30 that Virgil has to turn around and walk back to limbo, back the way he came, because he was unbaptized. And the reality is that Dante had already raised this whole notion of the unbaptized being, if you like, barred from heaven. And he had raised the question with Virgil in Canto 3. And he raised it again vehemently, but he never really seems to have resolved it. And so we have this very sad, I think, very sad episode in the whole story where Virgil had to turn around and walk away. And so we come to Paradiso. I think that probably one of the most graphic examples, if you like, in Paradiso, and it's not where you might expect to find it, is the story of Piccarda Donati. How she was forcibly, as you know, taken from a convent by none other than her brother and forced into marriage. And I think that resonates, again, with the present day very strongly. And that's what I've chosen to do in that regard. We have the rash promises of Agamemnon, and then we have Cleopatra. And what I find interesting about this one is that Dante actually mentions in the canto that sad Cleopatra weeps as she fled the standard and suffered an atrocious death from the asp. And I wonder, was Dante at this stage beginning to mellow slightly? Because if you refer back to Inferno 3, he actually has her condemned along with all the rest of the lustful. And yet here he seems to be, if you like, mellowing slightly. I wonder. I'll never have the answer to that, I'm sure. Karina probably will have insights into that.
That's a good one.
So, just being very conscious of time, and also the fact that anyway you've seen all of these slides, it means we can kind of speed things up a little. But I think as well, it would be important for me to say that I don't think Dante himself knew exactly at the beginning of his journey what really was the true nature of his search. And he set out, we know, to search for the meaning of love based on one individual, Beatrice. But I think in the process, he discovered something much, much more profound. The universal love of mankind, community. And I think in that discovery and journey, Dante reveals himself as someone who really has a very deep understanding of the nature and, importantly, the necessity of the human scheme of community. And however flawed his mechanism might have been from a political point of view, he had a very, very clear acute understanding of the way a city-state, and by extension nation, needs to be structured as an entity for good government. And at its core, he rightly concludes there must be social justice. And I think that was one of Dante's focuses right through the Commedia. So to my way of thinking, here we have Dante, the poet, philosopher, and politician fused into one. And when he delves into that idea of the just society as the rock on which civilization should, or more probably accurately, can be based, everything that he stands for, warts and all, comes from the human desire for social justice. He placed also all his trust in princes, and it was, as we know, a prince of the Roman Catholic Church in the person of Pope Boniface VIII, who was literally central to Dante's downfall. And that, in turn, became the focus of Dante's hatred. And so now we have another element in the whole mix of the Commedia, the other side of love, hatred. And it's this new ingredient which really gets into the mix and makes it all so dramatic and, importantly, so completely human. And it begs the question, can there really be a heaven without a hell, or good without evil? This one here is where Dante is examined by St. James on the concept, on the idea of hope. And I'll deal with that very shortly, just a little bit later. But another thing I wanted to mention was that another part into the mix, another ingredient into that whole mix that I've been talking about is the element of exile. And I don't think we can really underestimate the effect that exile has on any one individual. I mean, we're very aware of what that is all about and its implications, particularly in the present day. And I think probably the most poignant lines ever written on the subject of exile are these words here that were said to Dante by his forebear, Cacciaguida. You shall leave everything you love most dearly, and this is the arrow that the bow of exile shoots first. You're to know the bitter taste of others' bread, how salt it is, and know how hard a path it is for one who goes descending and ascending others' stairs. My God, like, it really does take a poet. And then we have St. Peter literally turning red with anger at what's been going on below with his successors. And then, you know, there is a question widely asked nowadays, are we killing God? I wonder. And there's certainly plenty of dystopian novels and films to serve almost as credible examples of what life and even death might be like in the future. I mean, the first thing that springs to mind is George Orwell's 1984, and also very pertinent today, as there's just recently been a series made along with based on the novel A Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And then there's another movie which I have to say intrigued me, and it's where a labor force of humans live a life of sordid drudgery on Earth, while the human elite live a life of privilege and luxury on an orbiting space station. I mean, is that outside the bounds of possibility? I wonder. And I think if we do allow ourselves, one way or the other, to slip away from a moral anchor, a code of human behavior, and importantly, a way to maintain it, but then it will become literally a melting glacier. It will be unstoppable. And imagine in a brief moment of fantasy, if we allow this to happen, what Michelangelo's creation of Adam might become in a future Sistine Chapel, converted into a fast food outlet with a soft drinks bar, Bernini's Baldacchino. I shudder to think. But Dante's structure of the Commedia was not just confined to interplay between people, but also the physical world. He actually paints the full picture. I mean, it's not surprising. He was an artist himself. Time and the times of day, dawn and the progress of the sun across the sky, the whole landscape, evening into night, all are interwoven into the narrative, not just as background, but actually as integral elements of the narrative. And we also see where elements, even smells, set the scene. And in all of this, the night sky and the stars play a very important role. So in conclusion, I think that the essence of Dante's Commedia is probably twofold. Firstly, that human greed, avarice, and self-interest are the root causes that undermine the path to good and justice.
Yes.
And then secondly, especially in the last three cantos of Paradiso, with their vision of the divine, the poet himself wants to make his audience aware that the just society he has longed for is already in place. And here Dante, the poet, the man, is returning from exile, not to Florence, he's done with all that, but to Paradiso, a place of harmony, a just society, a popolo giusto e sano. And so that concludes the Commedia. So the Commedia really, with its huge cast of characters and episodes of moral behavior, I think it compresses time into less difference than we might think. It really mirrors us in the past, in the blink of an eye with the present. And I think I'd like to end by, if you like, refocusing on the plight of Piccarda Donati. Many, many women still have no voice. And again, we see the destruction of the lives of so many people and their aspirations for their children through lack of just and wise leadership. And mankind's search for meaning and purpose is very far from complete. And what concerned Dante Alighieri in his time is our here and now, and crucially, I think, our future. And we, like Dante, must cling, even with our fingertips if we need to one element in which he believed fervently, and that was hope. And with the Commedia as a guide, that hope for the future, I really believe, can be formed on the basis of a learned framework built on the experiences of history as a path through the dark wood, our selva oscura of doubt and error for humankind. And that's why I think we are, perhaps, and maybe always will be, a work in progress. Thank you.
I think that was beautiful, Liam. Thank you very, very, very much. I don't know how others feel about it, but it's been just lovely to see it all again. We saw it, as I say, canto by canto by canto through the year. And for some who were not at the readings, I know from other contacts that they know their Dante and they know your book, but this going through it, it has been just wonderful. And you have caught very much what Dante himself says of himself before he writes the Commedia, that he was an ethical philosopher. And I think you've really caught the ethics of the Commedia, which are just timeless, and the sense of justice that we need in the world, and how this just underlies so much. But also there's the beauty in going through it as you did. There is the beauty of just the cosmos, our world, our environment, and beyond, the stars, the moon, that amore che muove il sole l'alte stelle. It's just lovely, really lovely. And I was interested in your touching on the loneliness of Virgil as he goes and Cleopatra, because we talked about that just a week ago, how Dante had released his comedy cantos at a time and was written over a period of time. Would he really have stood over some of the decisions of hell when he had come through that experience of life? Because life does teach you and it changes you. And certainly there is in the Virgil, I think the best celebration of Virgil in the Commedia is the eagle in those two cantos where you have the eagle in Paradiso, and Beatrice is not even mentioned. She doesn't speak. She just doesn't belong in those two cantos. And the image that Dante creates is of the man who has lived the worthy life but hasn't been baptized, and should he not be saved? You know, so I think when one reflects on certain aspects, you see his doubts, Dante's doubts, rather than his certainties. But you really have brought it out in a beautiful way.